Time for school! Children often complain about going to school, but what they don't realize is how lucky they are to be getting an education. They could be here, working 10 to 14-hour days, hunched over a machine, making product after product, trying to keep all their fingers, and more importantly, trying to keep their job. This was the fate of many children during the Industrial Revolution in the United States. From 1865 to 1915, the Industrial Revolution was proliferating in the United States. The Industrial Revolution was a time when our nation's economy was shifting from the home goods-based cottage industry to a factory, mill, and heavy machinery system to produce the everyday goods that people wanted and needed. The heavy machinery at the factories and mills required people to operate them in order to ensure that the products were made efficiently and the factory functioned smoothly. As more inventions were produced to satisfy the demand of goods, more workers were needed to work the machines. However, factories and mills could not always afford to have adult workers that required high pay. In reaction, owners of these factories turned to children to acquire work. Children were first used in the mills and factories because they were a cheap source of labor, which saved the companies they worked for money. Children worked mainly as coal miners, street workers, and factory laborers. In the coal mining industry, children accounted for the majority of the workforce. The child miners were mostly young boys. These young boys performed a number of different jobs based on their age and ability. Breaker boys worked above ground, sorting slate and other debris from the coal while great amounts of toxic dust filled their lungs and covered their eyes. John Spargo, a British granite cutter who later became a revolutionary union organizer and socialist, moved to America in 1901. He describes his findings at the coal mines and his experience when filling in for a young breaker in his widely read, influential novel, The Bitter Cry of the Children. He writes, "I once stood in for a breaker for half an hour and tried to do the work a 12-year-old boy was doing day after day for 10 hours a day at a stretch for 60 cents a day. The gloom of the breaker appalled me. Within the breaker there was blackness. Clouds of deadly dust unfolded everything, the harsh grinding roar of the machinery and the ceaseless rushing of coal through the chutes filling the ears. This was the life of a breaker boy in the mining industry." Child street workers scurried around the streets of large cities facing the bitter cold and windy winters and the scorching hot boiling summers, working for wealthy men to earn a dime or two. Telegraph messengers carried messages to and from businesses. Shoeshine boys shined the scuffed shoes of rich men's feet as the rich men read their newspapers which they received from the newspaper boys. These boys were on their feet for hours trying to find work. These children very rarely slept as the city was always bustling and their labor was always needed. Children working in the factories did not have it any easier. The complex machinery was very dangerous and had to be dealt with very carefully to prevent injury. Spinner girls toiled for 70 hours a week, tying threads at rapid speeds onto bobbins, cooped up in a stagnant, sticky, and humid environment, breathing in lint that hung in the air. Doffer boys constantly replaced every empty bobbin on the spinner, being very cautious as it was easy to lose a finger or a hand on the quick-paced machine. In sweatshops where clothing was produced, children toiled for 10 to 12 hours sewing cloth and handling poisonous glues and dyes. In fact, the owners of the sweatshops would often lock the doors of the room so that the children could not escape their work. By 1900, approximately 2 million children under the age of 16 were employed. The nation's economy was booming because of the great number of products being produced. Businesses were making more money in return because of the child laborers. Not only did the nation's economy now depend on child labor to keep the economy booming, but families also depended on the additional income their children were making. Children had to work because their family needed their income in order to pay rent and put a loaf of bread on the table. Children were contributing about 1/3 of the family's income. Most of these families that depended on their child's labor were families immigrating to the United States because these families were very poor. Although some parents did not like their children working, they realized it was the only way to prevent starvation. However, some parents wanted their children to work. A New York Times article written on December 26, 1882, called "Toiling for Their Bread," states, "Such parents have also themselves, in all probability, been accustomed to toil and privation from the earliest years, and they see no unusual hardship in the fact that their children should in turn take upon their shoulders the burden which was early fixed on their own." All this work took a toll on children. Children had miserable lives and their work began to affect them physically and psychologically. Children were losing fingers and hands because they were cut off in machines. Children began developing spinal issues such as scoliosis from standing or sitting all day on hard surfaces hunched over in an unnatural position. Some children even died. In the coal mines, children would die because of a mine collapsing and tons of rock would crush their body into the ground. In The Independent, a collection of primary sources, a miner describes his story. In his autobiography, he says, "There were 5 of us boys. One lies in the cemetery, 50 tons of top rock dropped on him. He was killed." Psychologically, children did not know how to play. They only knew work and work alone. The majority of them were illiterate, and they were not given new opportunities because of their lack of an education. Not only was their lack of an education hurting the children and their families, but it was also hurting the nation. The nation was breeding thousands of illiterate children into thousands of illiterate adults that only knew how to work a machine. They did as they were told, and that was it. They did not think for themselves. They had the factory think for them. They were letting machinery run their lives. In 1904, people finally decided to take a stand to reform child labor laws and save children from the abuse they were facing in the factories. The National Child Labor Committee was organized on April 25, 1904 at Carnegie Hall in New York City. In response, the government gave the National Child Labor Committee a charter, and followers swarmed in to join the fight to protect children in 1907. Both men and women fought to save the working children. The people decided that the nation had to be awakened to see the truth about the factories. In 1908, the National Child Labor Committee hired Louis Wick Hine. Louis Hine was a photographer and anthropologist that took pictures of the working children. These pictures showed the misery and hardships children had to endure. His revolutionary photographs awakened the nation, and the committee continued to gain more supporters. The nation had been awakened to the horrors of the factories and the poor treatment of children. People wanted reform, not only for their children, but also for themselves. In 1912, people reacted. The revolutionary Bread and Roses strike took place in Lawrence, Massachusetts. The Bread and Roses strike was led by industrial workers, specifically girls in Lawrence between the ages of 14 and 18 that worked in the textile mills. Because of this radical strike and other strikes like it, reformation in labor laws began to occur. Unions began to form to ensure that workers were treated properly. Unions became helpful in supporting the cause to abolish child labor. Mr. Kent Wong, director of the Labor Center and a professor at UCLA, states,
"Unions worked very hard to demand legislation that brought about an end to child labor."
In 1920, the Supreme Court began to get involved in the abolition of child labor. Many bills, such as the Keating-Owen Act, written in 1916, were produced, but all were rejected. In 1938, child labor was officially abolished in the Fair Labor Standards Act. This law stated that products made by children could not be bought or sold. This law also said that no child could work until they reached the age of 16 unless they possessed working papers, which they could only acquire at 14 years of age. In addition to the Fair Labor Standards Act, it was also decreed that all children must attend school. The Industrial Revolution caused children to be subjected to labor in poor conditions, causing great problems for children and the nation. Due to the formation of the National Child Labor Committee and the reactions to Louis Hine's realistic pictures, people began to take a stand for their children in order to reform child labor laws and save them from the horrors of factory life. By striking and fighting for their children's rights, the government reacted and reformed child labor laws and gave children their rights. Because of these revolutionary movements, all children in the United States are now given an education and are protected from the industrial world. Although this problem was solved in the United States, there are numerous countries such as China, Pakistan, India, Yemen, and many other countries in Africa that still force children to work in terrible conditions, causing grave effects on their physical and mental health. Child labor needs to be abolished throughout the world in order to give children their right to an education and, more importantly, their childhood.
Just close